Today, we are cracking open a pretty wild case file. It doesn't just, question our understanding of the universe. It puts the entire standard model of cosmology on trial. The document is called a forensic audit of cosmic time, and believe me, its claims are absolutely explosive.
All right, let's just dive right into the core accusation because this document does not mess around. It opens with a complete bombshell. It claims that the 13.8 billion year age of the universe, that it isn't a scientific discovery at all. Instead, it calls it a theological coup disguised as mathematics. In other words, the argument here is that this whole timeline was created not from pure evidence, but to prop up a philosophical belief system, a metaphysical hallucination, as they call it, specifically designed to dodge the very uncomfortable implications of a universe that has a clear directed beginning.
So, how in the world does the audit even begin to build a case that radical? Well, it starts by attacking the very foundation of how we investigate the distant past. It argues that we've made a really critical error by confusing two fundamentally different kinds of science. So the document says there's a foundational crime right at the heart of modern cosmology, and that's confusing what we can test in a lab with what it calls reverse storytelling. On the left, you've got operational science, think chemistry experiments. They're repeatable, you control all the variables, you know exactly what you're starting with. But on the right, you have historical science, and according to this audit, that is a totally different beast. It's trying to reconstruct a one-time event, the origin of the universe, from the messy, tangled evidence we have in the present. The audit calls this a mathematically ill-posed problem, which basically means there isn't one single verifiable answer. You have to make unprovable assumptions just to get started.
And right here, the audit takes aim at the very makeup of the cosmos as we know it. Get this. It highlights that everything we can actually see and measure, all the stars, the planets, the galaxies, that only makes up a tiny 5% of the universe. The other 95%? That's dark matter and dark energy, which are, for all intents and purposes, complete unknowns. Now, the document doesn't pull any punches here. It calls these unobserved placeholders a metaphysical Ponzi scheme. The argument is that they aren't real discoveries, but just massive mathematical patches that were invented for one reason, to keep the standard model from completely collapsing under the weight of evidence that contradicts it.
And that leads us directly to the prosecution's next major charge. The audit claims that the very tools and methods we use to establish deep time, the so-called clocks of the cosmos, are fundamentally broken and totally unreliable.
So first up on the chopping block is the gold standard of deep time, radiometric dating. The audit points to things like the helium retention paradox. Okay, so in simple terms, when radioactive elements in these little zircon crystals decay, they produce helium. Now, if these crystals were really billions of years old, most of that helium should have leaked out by now, right? But scientists are finding way more helium than they expect, which, according to this audit, suggests the decay must have happened much, much more rapidly. It also points out the leaky cage problem in another dating method, arguing that the argon gas used for dating doesn't always stay trapped in the rock, which can create a false illusion of incredible age. Next up, the audit alleges something it calls epistemic cannibalism, which is a wild term. It's where one set of assumptions is used to justify another, creating this totally closed loop. It brings up the KBS Tuff controversy as a prime example, where radiometric dates for a volcanic layer were just thrown out. Why? Simply because they didn't fit the accepted timeline for human evolution. The theory came first, and the data had to be made to fit. It also describes a parasitic loop, arguing that carbon-14 dating is calibrated against certain historical records, like Egyptian timelines, but then it's turned around and used to disprove other ancient records, like the Torah. You see? It's a system that just confirms its own bias.
And this all builds to the source's next point, that new, powerful data is pushing the standard model into a state of total crisis. It points to the Hubble tension, this major, persistent disagreement between different ways of measuring how fast the universe is expanding, and it highlights the shocking discoveries from the James Webb Space Telescope, these so-called red monsters. These are massive, fully formed galaxies way back in the early universe. They look way too mature, as if they were born old, and that just directly contradicts the standard model of slow, gradual galaxy formation.
Okay, so having presented its case against the physical evidence, the document makes this really dramatic pivot. It basically argues that if mathematical models are failing us, we need to start looking for a completely different kind of data. And this brings us to the document's crucial pivot point. If trying to reverse engineer the past from physical evidence is, as this audit claims, a total dead end filled with assumptions, then where else can we turn? Is there another form of data that can give us a precise, anchored point in history?
And the audit's answer is a radical shift from the laboratory to the courtroom. It proposes that the only way to move from the fog of probability to the clarity of precision is to introduce testimony, a direct account from a witness. And here it is, the audit's star witness, the national revelation at Mount Sinai. Now, the document doesn't frame this as some quiet spiritual vision. No. It's described as a physically overwhelming event, what it calls a Thermo-Acoustic Singularity. It describes a divine voice being broadcast with such immense power that its frequency literally shattered cedar trees, and the shockwave caused the immediate collective death of the entire nation. According to the record, they were then resurrected, only for the entire experience to repeat itself. Just unbelievable.
So look, that is an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. So the crucial point is this: how does the document even propose to verify this testimony, which was supposedly witnessed by millions, across more than 3,000 years of history? The audit presents what it calls a formal 40-generation chain of custody. And this isn't presented as some matter of faith. It's framed as a documented, legally binding transmission of information, from Moses at Sinai all the way down to the final codification of the Talmud. The source uses a really modern analogy here. It calls it a distributed ledger, kind of like a blockchain. The idea is that the entire nation acted as these decentralized nodes, making it impossible to falsify the record. This transmission was secured not by blind belief, but by legal necessity and public knowledge.
But, an internal record is never going to be enough. The audit argues that the absolute gold standard of proof is what it calls hostile node verification, getting confirmation from your enemies, from people who would have every single reason to deny your record, not support it. So the first piece of hostile verification is the Merneptah stele. Around 1208 BCE, an Egyptian pharaoh carves this huge monument boasting that Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. Now for the audit, the boast itself is totally relevant. What's absolutely crucial is that it confirms a distinct people called Israel existed as a recognized power in the land of Canaan at exactly the time and place the Torah's historical record says they would.
Next, we have the Tel Dan stele. This dates to the 9th century BCE, and it was put up by an enemy king celebrating his victory over the house of David. For decades, many scholars had claimed that King David was just a myth, a legend. Well, according to this audit, this inscription from a hostile source directly corroborates the biblical account of a Davidic dynasty.
And finally, there's the Sennacherib prism. This Assyrian artifact from 701 BCE gives the king's own detailed account of his siege of Jerusalem. The audit points out that the names, the places, the whole political situation described on the prism, it aligns perfectly with the parallel account written by the prophet Isaiah. It's presented as direct authentication of the biblical narrative, straight from the mouth of the guy on the other side of the battle. So after laying out this whole case against cosmology and presenting the evidence for its own testimony, the audit moves to its final verdict. And it frames the conclusion not as just a simple finding, but as an inescapable choice between two completely competing worldviews. And here is that closing argument. On one side, you have a worldview of a random explosion and unguided processes, which absolutely requires deep time as a kind of surrogate creator to make it all work. On the other side, you have a worldview of a functionally mature origin kicked off by a direct speech act, which requires an unbroken, witnessed chain of custody to be credible. The document then delivers its formal verdict. On the charge of scientific validity, it finds the 13.8 billion year figure to be a syntax error, not a measurement of time, but a mathematical mirage. And on the charge of historical veracity, it finds the 5786 year record to be a sovereign legal fact secured by a continuous legal tradition. And the audit concludes with this final, incredibly provocative framing. It argues that the real choice is not between science and faith. Instead, it says it's between a verified chain of custody and a schizophrenic conspiracy theory. Because to reject the Sinai account, it claims, you have to believe that millions of parents in every single generation for over 3,000 years successfully conspired to teach their own children a massive lie about their collective past, a lie for which their ancestors died. The audit leaves us with a stark choice. Which of these two stories requires the greater leap of faith?